Enron and financials, Volkswagen and emissions, Lehman Brothers and subprime mortgages, Uber and its tech bro culture, Facebook and harvesting data. What do they all have in common besides a huge drop in shares? Well, obviously, as on screen, ethical issues. But what is ethics? And what does that mean for day to day for you, for showing up to work? And is there even a sense of what morals and ethics should be in business? For example, how do you handle theft by employees? How do you get people to work extra hours if you can't pay overtime? Should you? How much do you need to tell your supervisor about what went wrong? Do you retain underperforming employees who support families? Do you let them go? If you had a business or accounting ethics course before, we're taking a different approach here. We want to consider ethical communication practices and what ethical leadership communication means. In this chapter and lecture, you'll learn the defining factors of ethical leadership, the basis of power, their costs and benefits, and their uses. You'll learn to differentiate between ethical, modal, and end values and be able to explain the four components of ethical behavior, their challenges, and how to improve them. I don't just want you to be able to define ethical leadership. I want you to be able to analyze it, recognize the challenges of defining ethical behavior, and be able to apply it to a variety of communication concepts. Moral leadership is a need of the day. It's a relatively trendy topic. It's been long needed and studied though. Think about working hours. In the 1830s, people were fighting about how long children should be working in factories. 10 hours a day? Every day a week? No limit? People asked, does limiting hours reduce children's ability to make money, and does limiting their hours take away people's free choice? That argument probably sounds kind of odd now, but it was a moral and ethical issue for businesses at the time. I'm sure 200 years from now, people will be shocked at some of what we did and what we debated, and not just in big picture scandals or major issues like modern slavery. You will need to make small ethical choices every day you go to work. Even reporting to work and calling Ferris Bueller here, not calling in sick to go to a baseball game, or, I don't know, taking a trip to Vegas, it's for work but not really working. All of that is an ethical decision based on what you think is right. Understanding the nature of ethical leadership will equip you to better engage in ethical leadership. Our book defines ethical leadership as the influence of a moral person who moves others to do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons, or a process by which a good person rightly influences others to accomplish a common good, to make the world better, fairer, and more humane. At a high level, ethics is concerned with the kinds of values and morals an individual or a society finds desirable and appropriate. Going back to our earlier chapters, we talked about leadership being a process where influence is involved. That influence dimension is important because leaders often have control, power, and influence over others. Their leadership affects other individuals and organizations. The leader's ethics establish the ethical climate for the whole organization. Northhouse explains that character is a fundamental aspect of ethical leadership, but by character he means qualities, disposition, and core values. This isn't who you are, this is how you choose to develop yourself personally and professionally. Northhouse uses 6 dimensions or pillars of character: trustworthiness, respect, responsibility, fairness, caring, and citizenship. You'll want to check out the table 12.1 in the book for more information on this. Actions refer to the ways a leader goes about accomplishing goals. Let's say you need to speed up response times. You'll have a lot of different ways to accomplish that goal. Each way will have different ethical implications. Showing respect involves listening closely to followers, being empathetic, and tolerating opposing views. Serving others. Clearly, serving others is an example of altruism, an approach that suggests that actions are ethical if their primary purpose is to promote the best interests of others. You may have heard of the servant leadership approach. It has strong altruistic components because it emphasizes how leaders should attend to followers' concerns and take time to nurture followers. Servant leadership also involves contributing to the greater good of others. Showing justice. Ethical leaders make it a top priority to treat all of their followers in an equal manner. This places fairness at the center of decision making. No special treatment, but if treated differently, explain why and have justification. I would argue that for a leader, you need to be just, but also make sure you are displaying that justice to the team so they can see it. Honesty might be one of the easier ones to think of with communication. We generally tend to dislike verbal and written lies, but this goes beyond that. Dishonesty can damage the person's character, damage organization performance, lower employee job satisfaction, drive out ethical workers, and there is a big uh-oh moment for an organization, undermine your team's or group's reputation, and disrupt communication and information flows. Let's say you ask your boss about a promotion and the boss holds back or appears to lie when she says, "We'll see." What do you do? Do you go back and get productive at your desk? Well, probably not. You're probably updating your resume, asking a coworker what happened, searching through your email for what went wrong, asking somebody else like, "Well, what happened when you asked for a promotion?" The boss may have avoided an honest answer for a variety of reasons, but by doing so damaged her own character and put a strain on your relationship. And that's intense sounding, I agree. But this is how you can break it down at a core level. Imagine instead if your boss said, "I can't discuss promotions until I get the budget approved," or "Your client-facing communications need to improve." More honest answers might sting, but it probably wouldn't leave you looking for another job. That's how an honesty can improve across the organization. Now let's say that you end up in an organization where you're noticing unethical behavior. Maybe it's a lie about submitting a report. Maybe it's submitting a weekly report without actually reporting that week's activities. Just copy and paste from last week. You have the power or the capacity to influence or affect others. Remember that earlier in this semester, leadership was defined as not needing to be a big boss. It happens at every level. A leader has power because he or she has the ability to affect others' beliefs, attitudes, and courses of action. Since power can be used in positive ways to benefit others or in destructive ways to hurt others, a leader needs to be aware of and sensitive to how he or she uses power. In the Chapter 1 lecture, we talked about the 5 bases of power and how they related to authority of position or assigned leadership, and authority of leadership, which is emergent leadership. You saw these bases pop up again, so let's think about them from an ethical perspective since, and I think this is where it gets more interesting in Chapter 1, all of these can be abused. Here you can see a table, and this is actually from another textbook called Johnson and Hackman's book on leadership communication. It's about the power and pros of cons of each type. So if you look at the cost-benefit ratios, you can see that leaders might want to rely on referent or expert power because they are forms of soft power, where you're not forcing compliance, but influencing through characteristics of a person. So, authority of leadership. Go ahead and pause and read through. I'm not going to read these out loud. Here are a few more bases of power. Same deal as the last slide. Recommend you pause and read. You might want to screenshot for studying. In any sense, the point I'm trying to make here is you don't want to rely solely on one form of power. Next, let's look at components of ethical behavior. James Rest at the Center for the Study of Ethical Development studied ethical behavior in the context of 4 communication processes. When one of these processes doesn't work correctly, ethical failure results. By following these 4 components, we can be more ethical leaders, and what I'd argue is just simply a more effective communicator. First up is moral sensitivity or recognition. So this involves recognizing the existence of an ethical issue. In other words, you can't solve a moral problem unless you notice it's there. So when we are morally sensitive, we consider how our actions impact others, identify possible actions and the related consequences with those choices. This sensitivity involves skills like empathy and perspective taking. We're thinking about other people involved and how they might react. A classic teaching example is, let's say I collected paper scantrons of a final exam and left them in the break room. The cleaning crew sees them, puts them into the secure recycling bin. They are shredded, they are gone. That cleaning crew absolutely followed policy. But the semester's over. So what do? Do I call in students to retake the exam? What if students have already left campus? With moral sensitivity, I'd care about the students and consider their perspective. That sounds great, but here's the challenge, and that's something called moral tunnel vision. This is when our mental scripts don't include ethical considerations. For instance, you might be focused on other criteria and not consider the ethical implications of your decisions. For example, grades are due. No grades, no teaching contract for next semester. The other example or topic you see on there is moral mum effect. So in this scenario where the professor has lost the scantrons, they've been shredded, professor knows no grades, no teaching contract next semester. Moral mum effect is the idea where if let's say that professor went and told somebody this happened, the other person wouldn't label that as unethical behavior. So the unethical behavior being leaving secured student information in an unsecured location. They'd worry about damaging the relationships. They might be like, well, I guess it doesn't make a difference. I don't want this person not to like me. So what they do is they sort of shut it down. So rather than calling this unethical, pointing out how problematic is that it is, it's just leaving it there. Or let's say they saw it in the break room and just stuck it back in the person's box. That would be another example of the moral mum effect. Let's get away from the classroom though. In the 1970s, Ford rushed the Pinto into production with a shortened time frame to compete with the European market. So that's 25 months compared to the average then of 43. It's always important to note that a condensed decision-making timeline can impact things. So this is something to watch for. The engineers were also required to adhere to the limits of 2,000 is what they called them. So that meant no more than $2,000 in cost or 2,000 pounds in weight. Ford knew of a problem with the Pinto from their crash tests. The gas tank would rupture after rear collisions and set the car on fire. So they knew they could fix the issue by moving the gas tank location. That was nixed. Time pressures, cost pressures, remember they were on that timeline. Even a small $11 modification was not made because of the $2,000 limit. Auto standards were also way lower then. The safety tests Ford did that discovered the problem were not required by law. They didn't legally have to make changes and report it. Additionally, Ford was reluctant to make changes because there was a widespread industry belief that all small cars were inherently unsafe solely because of their size and weight. And also there was this corporate belief that safety doesn't sell, which is really funny now, right? But at the time, safety didn't sell. Ford had tried to make that a marketing theme in the past. It did not work out for them. Here's where moral tunnel vision comes into play. The National Highway Traffic Safety Association allowed automakers to use a cost-benefit analysis to examine safety standards. This involved an assessment of human life. So in 1970, each fatality cost $200,000 by the standards. So an internal memo with the cost-benefit analysis, Ford determined that a recall and fix was not worth it because of the cost of human life being $200,000 per death. Their mental scripts looked at this choice from a business lens and didn't consider the ethical and moral issues involved. Ford was later indicted for criminal negligence and ceased production of the Pinto. They literally put a value, $200,000, on human life. This, of course, isn't just part of business history. A really good recent example is Kohler. Their generators, particularly their marine generators, where people were putting them on houseboats, Kohler knew because of some faulty tubing, this is about 20 years ago, were causing carbon monoxide poisoning. They are still in court about that. They have had continued issues, which is so shocking to me, having first covered it as a reporter back in 2002. Kohler, Volkswagen, Chrysler, they've all been involved and are all involved in lawsuits about default devices. And so that is, to put it simply, it changes the emissions test results. So this is not something that is out of the history books. This is still something that is a current and really significant issue for this industry. When an individual or multiple individuals are reluctant to label unethical behavior as unethical for fear of being associated with the message and damaging the relationships, this is that moral mum effect. Happens at all levels, not just with leaders. So looking at the Ford Pinto issue, perhaps there were people on that committee that didn't have moral tunnel vision. I mean, obviously some did, but instead they were experiencing the moral mum effect and were afraid of bringing up this ethical issue. Now, as you're seeing on the slide, there are ways to improve moral sensitivity, to fight moral tunnel vision and moral mum effect. These ways include active listening, changing your schemas, fighting the moral mum effect by labeling things with ethical terms. For example, communicating, that was wrong of the team to submit the data when you knew it was incomplete. Supervisor moral talk contagion, that's like the fanciest term I think we've used this whole semester. But supervisor moral talk contagion is a fancy term for something really simple. You do the right thing and you show people it. You can increase moral sensitivity and fight the moral mum effect of others by modeling moral talk to followers. If leaders consistently include ethics as an important topic of conversation, it can empower followers to speak up when they see an ethical violation. Being able to walk through how an ethical decision impacts others, has consequences, violates law, all of that will help followers be more aware of ethical issues as well. Great research article by Zanin in 2016 found that subordinates are more likely to confront unethical business requests. So, for example, charging out a lunch as a business lunch when it wasn't, if their supervisor is known for discussing ethics and asking others about the ethics of situations. Really interesting how that just simple communication tactic has the power to prevent, I know this is a bit of a logical fallacy here, but ultimately can prevent later legal issues or personnel issues. But of course, you can't model moral behavior without making moral judgments. Moral judgment involves choosing the most appropriate behavior from the different courses of action in the moral sensitivity component. These decisions are made through ethical reasoning. You're thinking about principles like justice, fairness, respect for others. There are challenges here, though, including ethical blind spots and faulty reasoning. Research shows that people often overestimate how ethical they are, forgive our own personal immoral actions, show bias towards our own in-group, and rely on prejudice and stereotypes in decision-making. Well, there's a whole lot of keywords from this semester laid into one sentence saying we tend to cover up for our friends. Research shows that we can increase our ethical competence by learning about ethical perspectives. Good news here is there is a strong correlation between higher education and reasoned decision making. That's why some local police departments like Frisco hire officers with college degrees despite state standards being lower. And there's a wonderful way you can make a research-based argument on how maybe policing can be improved. Understanding and being aware of our biases can also help. Listen to your emotions. Interestingly, research shows that contrary to previous thinking, emotion enhances moral decision making. Emotional and cognitive areas of our brain are working during ethical problem solving. So you want to consider our emotional reaction to our decisions in addition to looking at ethical reasoning. Does it feel right? The motivation for your decisions should come from moral values and concerns for others rather than other values, like shared values or security, being one of the cool kids, being the big boss in charge. If that's your motivation, people are going to notice. Moral motivation is difficult because there is a lot of pressure associated with those other values. This is especially true when an organization emphasizes those values in sacrifice of ethics in their actions. Think of a company that lies to investors, that overstates its potential in its new product, that semi-bribes local officials to get a tax break. Or what about an accounting manager who wants to alert people to illegal accounting practices at a company, but she's worried about job security, providing for her family? What if the company closes? What if she gets fired? So she says nothing and hopes it gets better. That's Enron, but that's also the moral mum effect. Let's go in another direction. Your company lost a big client. It's budget cut time and your boss lets go all the part-time employees. You're mad because your best friend was part-time. You're stressed out now. Your workload is increased. The boss is out of the town for a week. So your boss actually takes a vacation, some luxury trip. Your moral motivation is tanked. So do you sit on YouTube, shop online, play some game on your phone? Do you keep up your normal workload? Does that hit close to home after this year? Yes, it is hard. We are not ethically perfect robots. On the flip of that, positive feelings like being optimistic that through a new closed account you can rehire part-timers, that can improve moral follow-through. And I would say in that situation, let's push that back to the supervisor. If the supervisor had set the tone of let's all focus on hiring new clients rather than taking a luxury vacation, well, there's an ethical choice that could have motivated all of the employees. So you're at your desk, you're mad, you're stressed out, you see a report that's due and not finished, and you're asking yourself, oh gosh, my boss is in Bermuda, and do I stay and do this report, or am I just going to submit a blank one? I can say whoops on Monday. So you're about to attach the blank report. How do you turn it around? So at an organizational level, especially as a leader or a manager, you want to create an ethically rewarding environment. So it's not just maybe skipping a vacation, because your boss should take a vacation too, so should you. But you should praise people for moral behavior and reward it. Make sure performance measures are not just results-based, but look at process too. So that's how goals are reached. This ethically rewarding environment can also do things like model moral behavior, communicate the value of ethics and incorporate it into decision making, rewarding ethical behavior, supporting whistleblowers, and like so much else. In the report example, that means remembering that when you make unethical decisions, it will promote unethical decision making by others. So let's say it's your boss and you attach that report, you've made this unethical choice. You're promoting unethical decision making by that supervisor, if that's the choice that you are making towards that supervisor. And I've also seen this happen in an academic setting where a professor feels like their students have been unethical, so then the professor's willingness or desire to return with ethical behavior is diminished. And gosh, as somebody who supervises professors, that is terrifying and awful, but it has to be curbed. At a personal level, think about regulating emotions. Note that destructive or negative feelings towards moral values try to reframe your perspective. Is it that simple? No, that is so hard. In this scenario, you might reframe this as not changing the workload. It might make people question your abilities if you're making mistakes. It might damage your reputation. And our very final topic, moral action involves implementing the moral decision. You can't just think, oh, that'd be a good thing to do. You got to do it. And is this easy? No. I mean, to be frank, I cannot imagine sitting, oh my gosh, take myself back as a woman to the 1970s and put myself in a room with Ford executives trying to speak up and say, this is a wrong way to value human life. I mean, I can't imagine doing it. Like, I know it's important. I know it should have been done. But wow, is that easy? No. There are huge situational pressures that create these massive challenges. And this can include opposition from others, fatigue, distractions. In the Pinto example, when I take myself back in time, I'm just thinking about culture and opportunity. But there are several ways to increase the chance of taking moral action. One is thinking about your personal history. So how have you handled obstacles in the past? What could you do differently? 2 would be believing you can make a difference. 3, recognizing your moral obligations, so to the organization, followers, coworkers, professional codes of ethics. Mastering the context is 4th. You want to be able to respond effectively and communicate when needed. That involves knowing what policies are, who are the key decision makers. We'll say, I've been talking and recording myself talking about this, but I would say there's something that came up the past week where somebody had made a bad choice, and when I have to stop and think, well, what's the policy? Oh, now I need to go check the flow chart for the key decision makers. All of that's caused more stress for me. So the more you can know that ahead of time, and even that's something now I've set in as a goal for myself, the more I can know that and have that ready, bookmarked, ready to go ahead of time is going to make it easier. 5th is building your communication competence so you can implement your chosen actions. You have to be competent to implement choices. And so that's part of the hope of this class, is that we've given you more tools that you can analyze people, analyze the situation, understand the impacts, and make really smart communication choices here. Ethical communication should also take into consideration how different business contexts can be, and that's norms, speed, culture. An ethical communicator will understand the defining factors of ethical leadership, apply them as they communicate truthful messages, complete in content, engage practices that encourage diverse viewpoints, avoid provoking intentionally emotional responses to manipulate people. You'll consider the audience and the audience's ability to understand the message. So let's conclude actually with the International Association of Business Communication has a code of ethics, and what they encourage, quote, being honest, being accurate, obeying all laws, protecting personal information, respecting free speech, honoring all cultures and beliefs, giving credit when due, and never profiting personally at the expense of the company, its employees, or partners, end quote.